Hello and welcome to A Gypsy's Kiss, the vlog. I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. Stick with us a couple of seconds and we're going to give you something revolutionary to think about.
And we're back. So, where were we last week when we left off?
Well, last week we had completed a discussion about where we believed the 9 clues in the poem to be. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion we came to was that each line, each sentence, each complete sentence, there being 9 of them, in the poem represents 1 clue. So the line, as I have gone alone in there, and with my treasures bold, I can keep my secret where, and hint of riches new and old, is 1 clue. Put in below the home of Brown is 1 clue. As a result, that puts a completely different perspective on how one has to look at the poem and what it represents.
Okay, so here we have a map in the poem. Poem equals map.
You're just looking at slides.
That's what I see. That's what it's telling me.
You got your poem, you got your map, and you got that equal signs. Okay. So here's the conversation I want to have. It is my opinion. It is our opinion, because we've talked about this, that for the most part, the majority of searchers, and I'm going to make the majority 50% plus 1, believe that the poem represents directions on a map, so that you start at, and these are for the searchers that take the easy route and talk about beginning at where warm waters halt. So let's just use that as an example. Mm-hmm. If I believe that warm waters halt at Ojo Caliente, New Mexico, because it's a hot spring, I can take the canyon down, I can drive the canyon down to a place where I have to put in below the fish hatchery where they raise brown trout. And that can be represented on a map. But a map, those kinds of directions, are directions on a map that, for all intents and purposes, is a 2-dimensional surface. Now, you might be driving over 3 dimensions because you're going over hill and dale and losing and gaining altitude the whole time. But the perception, for the most part, is that the map represents directions on a 2-dimensional surface. And I have a problem with that.
You have a problem with that?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at it. And the first thing, the first way that you have to look at it is that on more than one occasion, Fenn has said that it took him 15 years to write the poem.
Okay.
15 years is a long time to write 9 sentences. Or if you want to look at it in terms of the poem itself, 6 verses of 4 lines apiece. That's a lot of time.
Yes.
The implication is what?
He's a very slow writer.
That's a good one.
He rewrote and rewrote and rewrote, was never happy with it.
That's right. He also said that, and I'm going to quote here, I felt like an architect drawing that poem. And what I felt was really interesting when he said that was how he said it. But I'm going to make another point. Let's look at that clip from Moby Dickens.
Okay.
The poem in my book is something that I changed over and over again. When you read the poem, it looks like just simple words there, but I guarantee you, I worked on that thing. I felt like an architect drawing that poem.
So he did. He said, I felt like an architect drawing that poem. An architect, not an artist, not a poet.
I thought the interesting phrase, or the interesting word in that sentence was the word drawing. Because that's a completely different implication. As you know, my daughter and my son-in-law are both architects, and I called my son-in-law, who has a very philosophical perspective of the work that he does in architecture, and I asked him, in your opinion, and I wanted to explore this, And I asked him, in your opinion, what's the discipline that one could study that most relates to architecture? And I thought he was going to give me something like mathematical, like geometry or trigonometry or, multidimensional trigonometry, whatever. And he said poetry. And I really thought that was interesting. I didn't prep him. I didn't tease him. I just thought.
Did you ask him why?
I didn't. I stopped there.
Oh. Well, bit of trivia here. Weird Al Yankovic is an architect. He got his architecture degree. And then he went on to be a songwriter. So poetry, lyrics,
there's got to be something
architecture.
There. To have Fenn say he felt like a poet, and to have an architect tell me that the closest discipline that relates to architecture is poetry. Well, here's another thing that we have to keep in mind. Fenn was a fighter pilot for most of his career in the Air Force. He started as an enlisted man in, I think, someplace in the radio thing. But because it was a period where they were requiring more pilots, they started looking for volunteers. He goes to OCS, then goes to fighter pilot school and passes. The interesting thing about a fighter pilot is that they have to see the world in a different way. And I think, based on Fenn's writings, that's what we see. He sees the world in a different way. So that led me to this question. What do fighter pilots, and very specifically fighter pilots, as opposed to generic pilots, and architects have in common?
Well, they have to study and really learn their stuff before they can fly or put up a building. And if they do anything wrong, they hurt somebody. And
that's right. Yeah, that's very good.
Safety factors in there.
That's very good. They do require unique and specialized training outside of just the normal training that would come with going to college. By the way, this is a photograph of the Human Rights Museum in Canada, and it was designed by a good friend of ours, Antoine Predock. So Antoine, if you're watching this, we used you as an example, not only of an architect, but in your case, a great architect. So there's one other thing. Well, I imagine there are a lot of other things that pilots and architects have in common, but there's one thing that I thought was really important in the context of the poem, and that is that pilots and architects envision their worlds in a three-dimensional space. And a map doesn't show us a world on a two-dimensional space, nor do directions that are represented on a map give us a sense of a three-dimensional space. But Fenn was both a fighter pilot, I was going to say he was a fighter pilot and an architect. He was an architect of the poem. Fenn was a fighter pilot and said he felt like an architect when he quote, drew the poem. That to us should imply that fighter pilot in him who sees the world, who has to see the world in a three-dimensional battle space, has to takes 15 years to write a poem that represents a three-dimensional space. And that's completely different from where most of us have been until this point. And my perception is that's a revolutionary way to look at how this poem is constructed. That look familiar to you?
That's the cliff dwellings of the Anasazi.
That's right. That is the dwellings that are actually mentioned, Mesa Verde in Colorado, that Fenn mentions in his book. And the way he mentions it is he talks about Richard Wetherill. You remember Richard Wetherill?
I've heard the name.
Okay. Richard Wetherill was the guy that discovered Mesa Verde and excavated it for most of his life. He was also the one that discovered those, 20 or 22 round turquoise stones that ended up in the silver bracelet that Fenn put in the treasure chest but wants back at the end of all this. The Anasazi, Wetherill discovered, and we have seen since then, also thought in terms in their ancient habitats, also thought in terms of three-dimensional spaces. So what's interesting about that to me is that the Anasazi, the mention of the bracelet, now becomes one of those aberrations. How does Fenn say it?
Aberration around the edge?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it may even be a hint for us. So the big question then is, if you were going to get directions from a pilot or directions from an architect whose closest discipline is poetry, or directions from an Anasazi with their minds envisioning the world in three dimensions, what would they look like?
Well, I would imagine they would include more of the sky down.
It would indeed. That gives you the impression, or maybe if it's not in the sky down, maybe it's the perception of the world through those three dimensions. So let me give you an example. Let's say I wanted you to give me directions from Washington, D.C. to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and what I gave you was Google Maps. So tell me a little bit about how those directions would look.
Oh, I don't know. Been there.
Oh.
You get on the road and you go this west.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
I
You leave
imagine.
Washington, D.C. on Route 66. Stop me when I get boring. You hit Route 81. You go south as far as Knoxville, where you pick up Route 40. And then you head west to Albuquerque, right? That's how Google would say it. That's how you would draw it on a map if you were giving me a map. And if you were giving me directions, you would say exactly the same thing. Let me try something else on you. Let's say you would ask me for directions, and I'm an ancient Anasazi, a fighter pilot, or an architect, and I want it to be intriguing. So I would say to you, go to the state that entered the Union as the 47th state in the Union in 1912.
12.
And then once you're there, find the county that was named after a famous duke of Spain. And then once you're there, locate where they're doing all this damned construction, but you get my point.
Get the orange barrels.
So it would be a three-dimensional look at the world versus a two-dimensional world. It would cause you, and here's we get back into that difference between knowledge and imaginations. Knowledge is on a map. Imagination is required to fly as a fighter pilot through three-dimensional space.
Okay, I'm going to get a little more into that. So what you gave me was historical information. So maybe if you were speaking to a historian, that would be good information for them. You know, the Duke of Albuquerque,
Right.
Duke City, the 47th state in the Union.
Right.
So these are historical facts. So that would be relevant to a historian. Now, an Anasazi who wanted to reach forward in time 1,000 years or more would have to tell us the lay of the land, because that's all that was there at the time. And if Forrest is hiding a treasure that he hopes is there for 1,000 years, the only thing that's not going to change is the land itself. So he might mention things like volcanic mountains to one side, or something that's never going to change, a river, geological features.
The way that Richard Wetherell found Mesa Verde was he looked at all the clues. They weren't exactly pointing him to that direction, but the Anasazi in their life had left clues behind. And so he looked at all the clues and found the place that represented their grandest achievement for all intents and purposes. And that's how you have to think. If you were an Anasazi living 1,000 plus years ago, and you wanted to leave directions to your place so that it was 1,000 years from now, you would have to do it in a way where the clues were sustainable. So if you were to say the Anasazi, our place, the Mesa Verde, is 20 miles from Craig Brown's house, the likelihood of Craig Brown's house, and the Anasazi were very sensitive to this, the likelihood of Craig Brown's house being there in 1,000 years are slim to none.
Plus, how would we even know it? I mean, we're lucky to know that there was a Plato and an Aristotle, that their writings lasted as long as they did, so that we knew they existed. But if it was Joe Brown, who lived next door to Aristotle, we don't know anything about him.
Richard Wetherell followed the clues the Anasazi left behind. And they were 1,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Fenn has done with his poem. He's left us a set of clues that can be followed 1,000 years from now, and they come in layers. As I have gone alone in there and with my treasures bold, all the way down to if you've been brave and in the wood. He's left us clues that will last 1,000 years. There won't be any Craig Brown's house 1,000
No.
years from now. So the poem doesn't equal a map. The poem equals a three-dimensional space that a fighter pilot and an architect could understand. But there's one more little thing in all of this,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, if you look at the poem, there are two references in the same sentence to a two-dimensional distance.
Two?
A two-dimensional distance. Yes, two references to it. There are 5 references to altitude. And for me, that kind of cements it. That tells me this is a poem written by a man who sees the world in a three-dimensional space. And when he writes a poem, describes how to navigate through that three-dimensional space.
So what are they?
Well, I'm not going to give you everything.
Oh.
There's got to be some kind of, I've got to, there's got to be a little
Well, I
bit
know
here
there's
to-
down and there's
Yeah.
down and there. Oh, they're gonna make you figure it out.
Yeah, so you go to the poem and figure out the 5 references to altitude.
There
4
you
of them
go.
are pretty obvious. One of them's a little bit tougher, but it's there. And then take a look at the poem from the perspective of describing traveling through a three-dimensional space. We think that's a revolutionary perspective on the poem.
Okay,
That's all I got.
that's all you have. What are we gonna talk about next week?
I've been thinking about that. I think I'm going to tell you what the most important word in the poem is.
The most
And as a result,
important word.
the most important sentence, and as a result, the most important clue.
Oh. So the most important word. Wonder what that could be.
You'll have to wait till next week to find out.
Okay. Anything else?
That's it. I'm done for today.
Okay, well, thank you so much for tuning in to A Gypsy's Kiss, the vlog. I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. Thanks for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.